On a summer morning in 1930, an entire community walked out of their homes, closed the doors behind them, and never came back. In every single house, they left the same two things: a Bible open on the table, and beside it, a small pile of oats. Then they boarded a ship and sailed away from an island their families had lived on for possibly 2,000 years. They were not driven out by a war. There was no disaster, no plague, nobody forced them. They asked to leave, and the letter they wrote explaining why is one of the saddest documents in British history. St. Kilda is a cluster of islands in the North Atlantic, far out beyond the western edge of Scotland. It is not a gentle place. It has some of the highest sea cliffs in Britain, and the water around it is rough enough that for much of the year, no boat could safely land at all. For most of its history, the people who lived there were almost completely cut off from the rest of the world. In a bad winter, no ship came for 8 or 9 months at a time. So, they built a way of living that needed nobody else. They grew what they could, they kept sheep and a few cattle, and they took most of their food from the cliffs. Scattered across the island were hundreds of small stone huts, used to store dried birds, eggs, feathers, and grain. A whole landscape built around surviving the next winter. The men of St. Kilda were famous for one skill above all others. They climbed cliffs, barefoot, on horsehair ropes, hundreds of feet above the sea. They did it to harvest seabirds. Fulmars, gannets, and puffins nested on those ledges in enormous numbers, and those birds were everything: meat to eat, oil for lamps, feathers to sell. The birds paid the rent, lit the houses, and filled the stomachs of everyone on that island, and they governed themselves in a way that fascinated every visitor who saw it. Every morning, the men gathered on the village street and simply talked until they agreed what work needed doing that day. No chief, no vote, no boss. Outsiders nicknamed it the St. Kilda Parliament, and it ran that island for centuries. The catch from the cliffs was shared out equally between the families. It was, by any measure, a remarkable little society. But there was one shadow over that island that lasted for generations, and for a long time nobody could explain it. For much of the 19th century, an extraordinary number of newborn babies on St. Kilda died within about a week of being born. In some periods, the majority of infants born on the island did not survive. The islanders called it the 8-day sickness. They believed it was the will of God, and they endured it, family after family, year after year. It was, almost certainly, a form of tetanus that infected newborns, and the most likely culprit was heartbreakingly ordinary. A traditional local practice involved dressing a newborn's umbilical cord with oil, stored in containers made from seabirds. Once bacteria were present, the same well-meant custom would have passed the infection to child after child. Once trained nurses and modern hygiene reached the island, the 8-day sickness largely disappeared. But by then, generations of children had already been lost, and a community that small cannot afford to lose generations. From the mid-1800s, something new started happening. Tourists, steamers began bringing sightseers out to St. Kilda to look at what newspapers called the most primitive people in Britain. The islanders were photographed, questioned, and gawked at like an exhibit. But the islanders were not fools. They sold the visitors tweed, seabird eggs, and carved souvenirs. And for the first time in their history, money started flowing onto the island. And here is where the trap closed, very slowly. Over about 80 years, money meant they could buy things from the mainland. Flour, tea, tools, clothing. Bought goods were easier than made goods, so the old skills were used less. And the island slowly stopped being self-sufficient without anybody deciding that it should. A community that had survived alone for 2,000 years became, within 2 generations, dependent on the boat. Then came the First World War. The Royal Navy put a signal station on St. Kilda to watch for German ships. For 4 years, the island had something it had never had before: regular contact. Mail arrived, news arrived. Sailors brought gossip, medicine, and paid work. In 1918, a German submarine surfaced off the island and shelled it, destroying the wireless station. Remarkably, nobody was killed. But when the war ended, the Navy packed up and left. And the silence that came afterwards was much harder to bear than the silence before, because now they knew what they were missing. The young people had met outsiders, heard about wages in cities and hospitals, and through the 1920s, they started to leave. A family here, a group of young men there. Every departure made the work of survival harder for everyone who stayed. By 1930, there were only 36 people left on St. Kilda, and that is below the number a place like that can function on. Cliff harvesting needed teams of strong men. Boats needed crews. The work was built for a village of 100, not for 36 people, many of them elderly. Then, in the spring of 1930, the crops failed, and a young woman on the island became seriously ill. She had to be taken by boat to the mainland for treatment, a journey of many hours across open ocean. She died there. For the people still on that island, it was a terrible confirmation of something they had known for years. If anything went wrong, there, help was too far away to reach them in time. Now, because it is an abandoned island with empty houses and open Bibles, all sorts of stories have grown up around what happened. That the island was cursed. That something on it turned against the people who lived there. Or that the government secretly forced them out. And the letter was written under pressure. And inevitably, somewhere on the internet right now, somebody is blaming aliens. At this point, I would be disappointed if they were not. But the truth needs no mystery at all. Because unlike almost every other story on this channel, the people involved wrote down exactly why they were leaving, and we still have it. In May 1930, the remaining islanders wrote to the government and asked to be evacuated. The letter is plain and practical. They explain that they can no longer support themselves, that there are too few of them left to work the island safely, that another winter like the last one will be beyond them, and they asked one thing above all, that they be resettled together and given work, so that the community itself might survive, even if the island did not. The government agreed, and the date was set for the end of August. They spent that final summer preparing, packing what could be carried, deciding what 2,000 years of living somewhere is reduced to when it has to fit into a boat. On the 29th of August, 1930, a Navy ship arrived in the bay. There were difficult jobs to do first. The sheep were taken off. Some of the working dogs, who could not be brought, had to be dealt with by their own owners. It is a detail the islanders spoke about for the rest of their lives. Then, in every house, they did the same small thing. They laid a fire in the grate, they opened a Bible on the table, and they left out a small pile of oats. It was an old gesture of hospitality, food, and scripture left ready for a stranger who might arrive after they had gone. They were leaving forever, and their last act was to be good hosts to somebody they would never meet. Then they closed the doors. They walked down to the bay, boarded the ship, and stood on the deck as their island got smaller behind them. Several of them later said that nobody spoke very much. They just watched until they could not see it anymore. They were resettled on the Scottish mainland, mostly in one area, so that they could stay near each other. And then somebody made a decision that is almost too poetic to be true. Many of the men were given jobs in forestry. Men who had spent their whole lives on a treeless island in the middle of the Atlantic were handed axes and sent to work among trees, most of which they had never seen before in their lives. Some adapted well, others never really did. Several of them spoke for the rest of their lives about missing the sound of the birds and the sea on all sides. Behind them, the village stood empty. The roofs fell in, the grass grew over the street, and St. Kilda became what it is today. A place people visit and photograph and wonder about. It is now a World Heritage Site, protected for both its wildlife and the extraordinary way of life that ended there. The story of St. Kilda gets told as a mystery. The abandoned island, the open Bibles, the village frozen in time. But there was no monster here, and no curse. There was arithmetic. Too few people, too far from help, in a world that had moved on without them. And the thing that ended St. Kilda was not isolation, it was contact. The outside world reached in, showed them another life, made them dependent on it, and then could not sustain them out there. What stays with me is not the empty houses, it is the oats. 36 people, losing everything they had ever known, and still stopping to leave food out for a stranger. That is not the end of a mystery. That is the end of a civilization, written in oats and closed doors by people who did the last thing right. If real stories with real answers are your kind of thing, then you are exactly where you should be. Next time, a man found on a beach in perfect condition, in a good suit, with every label cut out of his clothes. No wallet, no name. and a scrap of paper in a hidden pocket with 2 words on it, in a language he almost certainly could not read. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.